This next example takes the code that we did in the last example and adjusts it just a little bit in order to make it more flexible on the page. So I'll run the code, and now I can drag and drop this item over here, but I can also pick it up and drop it back to its original origin. So now what I'm doing is adding role selectors into the mix so that multiple items on the page can be set up as drop zones. So let's again start down at the bottom of the script. So the first thing that you'll notice is I'm doing a selection against any elements that have the data-role of drag and drop container applied to them. If we take a look at the markup, what I did was I added in those data-role attributes to each one of the divs. So each div now plays the role as a drag and drop container. That's why I was able to drag and drop over both boxes, because now the events will be registered into both of these elements. So once I have the collection of drop containers, then I can iterate through each one of those. Now, if you remember from the module on selection, what I'm dealing with at this point is a node list. So it's not exactly an array. So what I've done is alias the for each function so that looping over that node list is a little bit easier. So here I'm calling for each on the drop containers. And then for each one of the containers, I'm handling the drop, drag enter, and drag over events. Again, still only implementing any logic in the dropped function, and drag enter and drag over are just getting canceled. Now to add a little more flexibility as to what can be dragged on the page, this time instead of looking at a specific ID, I'm looking at any element that has draggable set to true. Now for the time being, that's only returning one element, but if I added more to the page, then I would have a collection of drag sources. So I'll iterate through each one of those drag sources and add in an event listener for drag start, which we'll call the drag start function. Now all the code up above is almost identical to what we looked at before. I have this one new variable which I've created called source container ID. And the purpose of this variable is to not allow the drag and drop operation on the point of origin. So you don't want the code to run if you're dragging and dropping an element on the place from which it came from. So that way the logic only runs if you're actually moving the item that you're dragging to another container. So in drag start, all the logic is the same except for the single line down here, which sets aside the parent element's ID as the source container ID. So in other words, as I begin to drag this image, drag start fires and it takes a look at the ID of this element here and sets it aside. So that when dropped is called, the drag and drop behavior is only enabled if the ID of the container that's being dropped onto doesn't equal the source container ID. So again, it just makes sure that it only runs the logic if you're actually moving the element that you're dragging around the page. And the rest of the code here is identical to the item before. Canceling default behavior, getting the ID of the source element and appending that to the target, getting the ID out of the data transfer object by calling getData using the text/plain content type, which is supported by most browsers except Internet Explorer, and in that case, it's using the text content type.